By the end of this video, you will know the real reason why the U.S. Federal Reserve hiked interest rates in 2022. You will learn how the U.S. and the capitalists planned and weaponized interest rate hike to harvest insane amount of cash and assets from other countries. Do you still remember the pandemic in 2020? At that time, President Trump started printing money in the name of giving money to the people. Everyone knows about that, but do you know where the printed money went to? This money will first be lent to banks at a very low interest rate, and then the bank will lend it to the capitalists at a higher but still very low interest rate. The capitalists in the U.S. were flooded with cash at that time. After Biden came to power, the money printing and lending continued, and the capitalists kept getting more and more cash. But there was a slight problem. Money printing causes inflation, right? Don't worry, the former and current chairman of the Federal Reserve told us resolutely that there will be no inflation in the United States. Of course, as we all knew, inflation took off in 2021, and we were all guaranteed that this was only going to be temporary. Or was it? When the Russo-Ukrainian War broke out in 2022, the Fed rushed out and suddenly displayed extreme concern for the country and the people, saying that it was time to raise interest rates to fight inflation. The interest rate hike cycle began, but at the same time, money was still being printed every single day. Here's the catch. The Fed told you that the rate hike was to fight inflation. However, the real reason behind was that it was time for U.S. to harvest the world after a decade of seeding and planning. Take Japan in the last century as an example. In the name of support, the U.S. transferred a high volume of mid to low-end production to Japan. Because of this, the Japanese job market flourished and the Japanese were making money and became rich. As we all know, Japan became the second largest economy in the world at that time. In fact, this was just the first step, fattening the target to harvest. The second step is to suppress. By signing the Plaza Accord, the U.S. forced the Japanese yen to appreciate in a short period of time, and products produced in Japan suddenly became expensive. As the yen appreciated, the assets, stock markets, and real estate skyrocketed in a short period of time. Everyone stopped working and used their money to invest in stocks and real estate. At that time, a group of Japanese people got so rich that they claimed they could buy land and real estate in the entire United States and rent them back to the Americans at lucrative prices. Was it really the case? The U.S. said, how about we sign the Japan-U.S. Structural Agreement to open up the Japanese market so that U.S. investors can come in and invest in the blooming Japanese market to boost the market even higher. At this point, the stage had been fully set and it was time to harvest. By hiking interest rate, incentives would be created for Japanese to sell their stocks and assets to cash out and convert them into U.S. dollars and put them in American banks to earn high interest without risk. This immediately caused Japan's assets to plummet. In order to prevent excessive amount of money flowing out to the U.S., the Japanese government had to follow the U.S. in raising interest rates. As soon as interest rates were raised, people who borrowed money and over-leveraged suddenly could not afford to their portfolio and rushed to sell their assets. Catastrophically, Japan's stock and property markets plummeted even further. At the perfect timing, U.S. capitalists showed up. They took their appreciated U.S. dollars to buy Japan's plummeting assets. Because of U.S. interest rate hike, a large amount of U.S. dollars returned to the U.S. This means that the supply of U.S. dollars outside the U.S. will decrease and the dollar will appreciate. Let that sink in for a moment. The U.S. capitalists were using appreciated U.S. dollars to acquire depreciated Japanese assets. To simply put it, every time we see the U.S. raise interest rates, we are ready to start harvesting. Back to 2022, who do you think the U.S. wants to harvest using this round of interest rate hike? Europe? They have already been harvested during the ongoing Russo-Ukrainian War. Japan and South Korea? They are already the back garden of the U.S. and they are not doing so well nowadays, so maybe next time. Basically, there is only one place left, China. In the past decades, the U.S. actually agreed to China's accession to WTO, which opened up China to do business with the world. The factories, manufacturing industries, and production of the entire world had moved to China as a result. In exchange, China began to lower tariffs, relaxed financial controls, and allowed foreign investment to enter China at a massive scale. By listing themselves on the U.S. market, many Chinese companies' valuations skyrocketed, and so were their stock market and housing market. Once the U.S. started their most recent interest rate hike cycle, you can see that both the stock market and the housing market in China had plummeted significantly, especially in the real estate market where we had companies like Evergrande that are in deep financial trouble. This was mostly due to the fact that many U.S. banks took the initiative in lending money to these Chinese companies, and raises in U.S. interest rate automatically put these companies at a very vulnerable financial position. The U.S. also leveraged Hong Kong by imposing sanctions geopolitically, handicapping Hong Kong's stock market, and triggered an immigration wave. The real purpose behind was to cut off China's financing channels through Hong Kong and to make sure any cash flow is cut off for China. At the same time, the U.S. was promoting divestment from China to other Southeast Asian countries as China's manufacturing alternatives for U.S. companies. If the Chinese economy was as vulnerable as the Japanese economy back in the 1990s, it will have to sell its assets at a low price and completely open up the financial market to the U.S. Logically, the U.S. capitalist will take the same appreciating U.S. dollar to buy China's plummeting assets, just as the case in Japan decades ago. However, for the U.S., raising interest rates above a certain level has its side effect. The U.S. risks their own banks, as we saw during 2023, the downfall of the Silicon Valley Bank and the New York Community Bank. Also keep in mind that the total U.S. debt as of today is already at $34 trillion. And in 2024, the interest payment will be as high as $2 trillion, accounting for 23% of the fiscal revenue. So where does this money come from? Just as we talked about in the beginning, the U.S. can print money and flood the market with dollar bills while risking inflation. So, besides from harvesting China, raising interest rates is necessary to take advantage of the expectation that interest rate cut is imminent. This helps make asset prices higher and benefits U.S. capitalists to cash out at a high level. Also, what if it does not work according to plan and China is more resilient to the raises in interest rate than the U.S. thought in the beginning? Then the interest rate hike serves one last purpose: trigger a global debt crisis. If the U.S. declares bankruptcy, the debt will be written off, but who wants to go bankrupt though? Actually, there are many. There is no need to surrender, and the U.S. can also pull the whole world down with it because banks around the world holds a large sum of U.S. Treasury debts and assets. Just like the 2008 financial crisis when Lehman went bankrupt. And places like Taiwan, Hong Kong, Malaysia, and Singapore were simply not able to escape. So if there is a debt where you do not expect you can pay off at any time soon, why not bring everyone with you and let them act as a buffer when you drop? And generally speaking, the U.S. would be the fastest to recover from crisis if we look at history. Now you have it, the real reasons why the U.S. Federal Reserve hiked interest rates in 2022.